Welcome to the College Neuro Network, a podcast series part of Simply Neuroscience's The Synapse. My name is Sasha.
And my name is Sarah, and we're your hosts for today. The College Neuro Network has discussions with undergraduate students studying neuroscience and neuroscience professors in order to gain insight into the neuroscience department and opportunities in the nation's top universities.
Today's episode is focused on Columbia University, a private Ivy League research university located in New York City. Known for its interdisciplinary core curriculum, curious student body, and accessible opportunities and resources throughout the city, Columbia is ranked number 3 in national universities by the U.S. News and World Report.
Today, joining us is Dr. Mariam Aly, an assistant professor of psychology at Columbia University, who also researches the interaction between attention, perception, and memory, and how they jointly influence our goal-directed behavior. Simply Neuroscience's founder and CEO, Chinmayi Balusu, is actually an undergraduate research assistant at Dr. Aly's lab. Welcome, Dr. Aly. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your experiences at Columbia as a professor of psychology.
Of course, I'm really happy to be here, and I think what you're doing is really great and important, so it's my pleasure.
So for our first question, we just wanted to ask if you could briefly introduce yourself and then kind of talk about what sparked your interest in neuroscience and psychology.
Sure. So as you heard, I have a lab at Columbia University, which I started 3 years ago, and my field is generally cognitive neuroscience, where I study attention, perception, and memory using methods like functional neuroimaging, studies of patients with brain damage, behavior, and eye tracking approaches. I was at Princeton before I came to Columbia doing postdoctoral work, and prior to that, I was a PhD student at UC Davis. And prior to that, I was an undergraduate at University of Toronto. In terms of what sparked my interest in this area, I'd say that for a very long time, I was very interested in aspects of psychology, but I didn't know that it was called psychology. So I had the false impression that psychology was primarily counseling, and I didn't know that there was like a research side of psychology where you could do experiments to investigate various aspects of behavior in the mind. But I remember as early as being maybe 7 years old and being really fascinated with visual illusions and wanting to understand what's happening in my brain to make this happen. And I didn't realize until college that psychology allowed you to study phenomena like that. So I initially went to college thinking like maybe I'd go to medical school or maybe I'd go into bio or chem. And I very promptly switched to psychology as soon as I discovered what it was. My parents were very alarmed, but I think it worked out for me in the long term.
Yeah, that's really cool. Both me and Sarah love asking this question just because we get so many diverse answers. And I think it's really a good testament to how interdisciplinary and diverse neuroscience is, and really the fact that there's so many topics within neuroscience that can like spark your interest initially. Our next question for you, we wanted to ask what factors drew you specifically to becoming a professor at Columbia?
Yeah, that's also an interesting story. I was fairly confident that I wanted to be a professor, although we all go through ups and downs in research. So I was fairly confident, but of course not 100% sure. But I figured I would certainly try, knowing that it's a very competitive job market. I applied very selectively the first year that I was on the market, only to schools that I felt had very promising programs in psychology and neuroscience, and particularly a lot of people that studied memory, which is one of my areas of research and something that I'm very interested in. So I applied selectively to a few schools. I initially didn't want to apply to Columbia because I didn't really want to live in New York City. But as chance would have it, I met my partner right before going on the market, and he lived in New York City. So that's primarily why I applied to this job, and it ended up actually being great. I loved the interview. I loved the people in the department. And so after the interview, Columbia rapidly became my top choice.
Yeah, I love that story. So we wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about what your day-to-day responsibilities kind of are as a professor, and like kind of what your daily schedule looks like.
Sure. Yeah, one of the upsides of being a professor, which for some people will be a downside, is that your job is very variable. So you wear many, many different hats, and that's good for people who like a lot of variety in their day-to-day activities, but it's not so good for people who prefer to focus primarily on one thing for extended periods of time. So, for example, when I was a graduate student or postdoc, I would spend most days, most of the time focused on research, when you're early in grad school, maybe you do a little bit of coursework, you might serve as a teaching assistant, but a lot of your time is focused on research. As a professor, you suddenly have a million different responsibilities. So you mentor undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, research assistants. You help them with their research. You might analyze some data. You might write a little bit of code. You spend a lot of time writing grants and manuscripts. You give talks at different institutions. You give talks at conferences. You participate in podcasts. You might do some outreach. You teach, often multiple classes. You do a lot of grading. You do a lot of service. So you serve on a lot of committees, including things like thesis committees for both undergraduate and graduate students, but also other kinds of committees like ones focused on departmental use of space or hiring committees. And you also do other service activities like reviewing papers for publication in journals, serving as an editor. So it's a very, very varied job. The proportion of those activities will vary a bit depending on the type of institution that you're at. So if you're at a very research-heavy institution, you'll spend more time doing research. But if you're at an institution that prioritizes teaching, then relatively more of your time will be devoted to the teaching side of things.
I think that's really incredible to hear how many like diverse responsibilities you have. And we also interview students as well, so we get to hear their perspective, and especially Columbia students, they talk a lot about how devoted professors are to their work and how much they do around campus. So I think that's really incredible to hear.
So our next question for you is, in your opinion, what sets Columbia's like neuroscience and psychology departments apart from those at other institutions?
Yeah, so I'll comment first on the psych side and maybe on the neuro side because they're quite different in some ways. The psychology department is relatively small in the sense that we don't have all that many faculty, which if you compare us to some peer institutions, they have a substantially larger number of faculty in their department. But that means that we're pretty tight-knit. We all know each other. We know the work going on in each other's labs. And so as a result, we're also quite collaborative because we know each other very well. The psychology department at Columbia, which is where I'm at, has a mixture of different areas of research. So we have some people like myself who study cognitive neuroscience. We also have people who study social neuroscience. We have people who study personality and social psychology. We have people who are focused more on quantitative methods. So we really have quite a variety of people, but we all work pretty well together. The psychology department at Columbia, the faculty there are primarily focused on human research, but not exclusively. We do have a small number of faculty who do work with non-human animals, including rodents and birds. However, the neuroscience department at Columbia is much more focused on non-human animal research. So most of the faculty with the neuroscience affiliation, not all of them, but a lot of them do work with non-human animal models, or they might take theoretical neuroscience approaches in which they're doing a lot of computational work. Some faculty have affiliations with both. So for example, I'm associated with the neuroscience department, so I can take graduate students to that department, but my primary affiliation is psychology. And that's pretty standard in the sense that I think most people who do human work are more likely to be associated with psychology than neuroscience, although that's just a general principle. The one other thing I wanted to say is the neuroscience department is quite large. There's some people from the neuro department who are at the medical school. Some of them are at the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute. But it's a much larger and more diverse faculty in some ways in terms of research focus. And the psychology faculty is a little bit smaller and a tighter-knit community.
Yeah, it really does sound like a really cool collaborative community though, which I know is really important for a lot of students. So that's amazing to hear. And our next question is, what is your favorite thing about teaching or working at Columbia in general?
Yeah, I guess one of my favorite things is having so many researchers nearby that have similar interests to me, but study it from a different perspective. So if you consider the psychology department, the neuroscience department, people at the Zuckerman Institute, people in even in engineering, some of them have overlapping interests. And then there's people at the med school generally. So if you consider that entire crowd of people, it's quite many different levels of analyses that focus on similar theoretical interests. So going back to the example of my interest in memory, you can find people who study memory from a computational perspective. You can find people who study it in mice or rats. You can find people who study it in non-human primates, and you can find people who study it in humans. And it's very easy to set up meetings with them or go to talks at these other Columbia campuses. And so it's a really vibrant community, and it's really cool to see all the ongoing research from many different cutting edge approaches.
Yeah, I remember when we were talking with Chinmay, she kind of said that there was really, you could find, there's something for everyone at Columbia, and I think that's really true. It seems like there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of learn about and explore there, which is awesome. So our next question is, how are neuroscience and psychology classes at Columbia structured? Are they more like lecture, reading, or discussion based?
Yeah, I think we have all three. So I'll focus on the psych department because that's what I'm most familiar with. But in the psych department, we have a psychology major, and we also have a neurobiology and behavior, or maybe it's called neuroscience and behavior. It's one of those. But it's another major within the psychology department that focuses more on the neuroscience component of psychology. And I believe that it's also a partnership with biology. And we have both types of majors in our department, and they take a lot of classes through psych, but they could also take classes through biology or statistics. So for both of those majors, you take a mixture of different types of classes. So you take intro psych, you also take a research methods class, which will help you think through how to design your experiments and how to think about what conditions you might have, how to analyze your data. You also take statistics, which is a very important part of being a neuroscientist or psychologist, although it might not seem obvious on the surface, but it's a really critical aspect of the field. And then you also take a series of courses in sub areas of psychology and or neuroscience. So you could choose to take classes that are more focused on cognition and perception. You could take classes focused on psychobiology and neuroscience, and then you could take classes focused on personality or social psychology. And those are typically upper level, primarily lecture-based courses. But in addition to that, as you're moving through your career trajectory, you could also take classes that are seminars, so they're discussion focused. They're often fairly small, so I teach 2 seminars that are 12 students each, and that gives a lot of rich opportunity for discussion, collaboration, and interaction. And those are typically higher level classes where you're reading papers, you're writing maybe opinion pieces, maybe you're writing a research proposal, maybe you give a presentation, and those are focused on much more narrow topics. So for example, I teach seminars specifically about the brain and memory, which is a subcomponent of the general class of psychobiology or neuroscience.
Yeah, so you just talked about some of like the classes and seminars that you teach. So we were wondering what was your favorite class to teach so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like all of them in different ways. I'd say maybe the one that I enjoyed the most and was the biggest surprise was my brain and memory seminar for undergraduates. The other classes I teach are an advanced graduate and high-level undergraduate class on detailed topics in memory systems. And I also teach a lecture course on cognitive neuroscience. But I think my favorite might be my brain and memory seminar because it's primarily maybe junior and senior undergraduates who have a little bit of experience in psychology and neuroscience, but are still new enough to it that most of the topics that are very familiar to me are absolutely fascinating and really exciting for them. And so what I really like is seeing that enthusiasm and excitement about some of these concepts, which to me now are so familiar that I don't really think about how cool they are anymore. So I really like seeing their energy and the fascination as we discuss those topics. And the undergraduates are wonderful, so they have lots of very cool ideas and insights that sometimes I haven't thought of myself. So I find it really rewarding to teach that class.
That's amazing. When we were sorry, I keep bringing up Chinmay, but when we had our interview with her, she also said, and other undergraduates from other schools, that they love like, collaborating with professors, and other professors love like learning from their students too. And that's just such a nice thing to hear, that like the learning kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that I learn from my students in all of my classes, and every time you think you understand a topic well enough to teach it, you probably like kind of do, but you're not quite 100%. And as you're explaining it and as the students question you, you realize that there's parts of it that you're maybe not 100% confident in. So you do learn from your students all the time.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That dynamic is really interesting, and I feel like it's rare to find in a high school classroom, and I think that's like something to look forward to, like as you go to college and you take seminar classes like that. And then kind of our next questions for you are related more towards your research. So we know that your research largely focuses on the intersection between various topics studied within neuroscience, such as attention, perception, memory, and behavior. So we wanted to ask you to expand a little bit more, because it does sound like a very holistic and very comprehensive approach to understanding neuroscience. You could talk a little bit more about the research you're currently conducting and kind of how your previous research has intersected.
Sure. Yeah, so I've been interested in memory for a long time. And so I went to graduate school with the idea that I really wanted to study memory, and I wanted to study it in populations that have brain damage that produces amnesia. A little bit by accident, I ended up doing a perception study, which I was just doing as like a kind of side project because my advisor needed someone to do this particular task. And in the course of running perceptual tasks in patients with amnesia, we actually stumbled on some really interesting findings that changed my focus a little bit. So I didn't end up doing my dissertation on memory at all. It was entirely about perception, but it was about how we could use principles that we know from memory research to better understand different aspects of perception, and how we can understand perceptual impairments in populations that are thought to only have memory impairments. So traditionally, people think that, if you damage your hippocampus, that often leads to profound amnesia, or if you damage the hippocampus and areas around it, leads to profound amnesia. And it was thought for a very long time that other parts of cognition were unaffected. So it's thought that, if you have damage to the system, your memory is impaired, but your perception is just fine. But around the time that I was in grad school, there was a lot of work coming out that challenged the idea that you can separate perception and memory in the brain so neatly. And so I did some studies showing that if the hippocampus is damaged, you do see some impairments in perception, and a specific type of perception that was impaired. And that inspired my general approach of trying to understand how parts of the brain that are usually considered to be involved in memory contribute to other functions like perception and attention. So most of my work focuses on understanding how regions like the hippocampus can contribute to attention and perception through their functions that are largely studied in the context of long-term memory. I also have tons of side projects, which I won't bore you with, but one of the neat things about being a professor is that you can engage in lots of collaborative research that goes outside your main area of work. So I also study how memory can guide prediction. I have some studies looking at how music can affect memory, some studies looking at memory for semantic facts and trivia in people who are trivia experts. We also do some studies looking at some eye movement behaviors. So there's lots of different things that you can do, although you typically have one thing that's your core research, which in my case is the attention memory interplay.
Yeah, I think that sounds so fascinating, especially because I feel like there's so many labs that kind of study like these isolated topics like memory or perception, and to see research being conducted about the intersection between the two and how they might be jointly related is really cool to hear. And so kind of our next question for you is, we wanted to ask what your future plans for research are, and if there's any topics you're planning on researching in the future and that you're excited to kind of dive more into.
Yeah, I think for a while at least, I'm going to be continuing two main branches that I mentioned. One is the attention and memory work, and the other is how memory guides prediction. Part of that is practical. I got some grants to study memory guided attention, so we have to use the money to do something related to those topics. So we have like a pretty programmatic and focused area of research revolving around the topics in those grants. Something else that I started recently was looking at some pharmacological manipulation. So we were very interested in how the acetylcholine system can affect attention and memory in the hippocampus. And this is based on some work in computational models and rodent research as well. And so we started doing some manipulations with nicotine to look at how agonists of the cholinergic system can affect hippocampally mediated attention. And so that's something that I'm really excited about. Those studies are more challenging to do because obviously you're working with drug manipulation. We have cigarette smokers in this case that do sessions when they are on versus off nicotine. So it's a little more time consuming and challenging than studies where you test college undergraduates, which is a large body of human psychology work at least. But that's some work that I'm excited about, and I'm looking to do more of it in the future. Obviously with COVID, we're not able to do a lot of in-person experiments at the moment, so that's on hold for now.
Yeah, those are really exciting. Our next question for you is we wanted to ask in general, how accessible are research opportunities for undergraduate students at Columbia?
Yeah, I'd say probably most or maybe all of the labs that I know have undergraduates in the lab. One big thing to think about is how you would want to do your research, in the sense of like which program will you use in order to get access to the research. And by what I mean is a lot of undergraduates volunteer in labs. Volunteering is not always feasible for people because obviously you maybe could be making money during that time. It's only really available to people who are financially secure and able to volunteer their time. So a lot of people do volunteer, but that's not always possible. So other things that you could do is you could do psychology research through the work study program, which will provide money. You could also look for labs that pay undergraduates to take part as a research assistant. Sometimes people sign up or they apply to be parts of the honors program. For the honors program, you get credits towards an honors degree, and those credits come from doing research in a lab. So you join a lab for 2 years, you do some research, you write a thesis, you give a talk, and you get those credits, and it's also a valuable research experience. So there's lots of different ways that you can get involved, but not all of the labs will allow all of those different approaches to joining the lab, so it's good to ask about that. The other one I forgot is that you could just sign up to do research for credit through something called supervised individual research. So it's less of a commitment than the honors program, which is 2 years long. So some people choose to go that route as well. And in general, I find, not all labs will be recruiting all the time. We get way more applications than we could possibly accept in our lab, because at any given time, maybe we'll have needs for, 3 to 6 undergraduate research assistants, but we get applications from many, many, many more than that. So I would encourage people to start looking early and apply broadly to many labs, because the one of your choice might not have an opening at that moment.
Yeah, I got it. I think that, like you were saying, that because there's so many different ways to get involved in research, and kind of like different ways to approach getting that opportunity, I think that's really good to hear as like high school students who are looking to major in neuroscience and perhaps do neuroscience research in college. So hearing that there's so many opportunities at Columbia to really dig in and start research as an undergraduate is really incredible to hear.
Yeah, maybe I'll briefly follow up by saying there's often also opportunities that apply for small grants that could fund, say, your work through a semester or something like that. So those are also worth looking into, and maybe partnering with a PI to help write the grant. It's not usually a ton of work, and it's not a lot of money, but it would be enough to support you through a semester or a summer.
It's great to hear. Our last question for you is, we were wondering if you had any advice for the high school students listening who want to apply to Columbia to study neuroscience or psychology in the near future.
Yeah, this is a tougher question because I know very little about the side of undergraduate applications. I would say that if you're not sure if you want to apply apply to Columbia or not. One thing that I found really valuable when I was applying is to look up the course requirements for different programs and just see if I would be genuinely interested in taking something in all of the different requirement lists, because sometimes you think a major is right for you, but then you start looking at the course requirements and you realize you're not interested in like 50% of the classes, and there might be a different major that is more suitable. Another question that I've had come up is, does it matter if I major in psychology or neuroscience? Like, does it matter for my subsequent career prospects or so on? I personally don't think it matters that much if your bachelor's degree is in psych or neuroscience. If you have an idea of what kind of career you might want in the future, it's good to think about trying to acquire the skills that would get you to that career. So one thing I really advise people to do is get some programming experience while they're an undergraduate, getting their undergraduate degree, because a lot of jobs nowadays you would benefit from having at least some exposure to a programming language. And so, for example, in statistics, if you're taking statistics, you might try to teach yourself something like R in order to help analyze the data that you have to analyze. And I think that will be valuable. But the psych and neuro programs, if you find that your interests align a little bit more with the classes in one versus the other, then I think choose the one that you think you would get the most out of. I don't think it matters that much which one you end up picking. And in the Department of Psychology, there is at least a fair amount of overlap between the required courses for psychology and neuroscience and behavior. So it's likely that you'd be seeing the same kinds of people and taking classes with the same professors anyway.
That's actually really unique advice. I guess we haven't heard that from other people we've interviewed before. So that's definitely something I'll look into, like all the classes I have to take for my major of interest.
Yeah, so that wraps up our questions for you. So we wanted to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to speak with us for the College Neuro Network. All of your responses were super insightful, and they'll definitely help any high schoolers listening who may be interested in applying to Columbia or just majoring or minoring in neuroscience.
Yeah, of course, it was my pleasure. And thanks again for doing this series. I think it's incredibly valuable, and I would have found it super valuable when I was in high school.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be able to interview you.